Chaos in the cockpit. What went wrong? Birgenair 301 calm before the storm. The humid Caribbean air wrapped around the Birgenair Boeing 757-225 as it sat on the tarmac at Gregorio Luperon International Airport in the Dominican Republic. It was February 6, 1996, and the night sky stretched endlessly above, shimmering with a million scattered stars. The crew was preparing for a routine flight, Birgenair Flight 301, a chartered service to Frankfurt, Germany, with a stopover in Gander, Newfoundland. Captain Ahmet Erdem, a seasoned pilot with over 24,000 flight hours, sat confidently in his seat. His sharp, experienced eyes skimmed over the illuminated cockpit instruments. First Officer Aykut Gürgen, younger but competent, performed his pre-flight checks with quiet efficiency. The relief pilot, Orhan Ulusman, observed from behind them. The atmosphere inside the cockpit was professional but relaxed. The three men, exchanging light-hearted conversation as passengers settled in. Weather is clear, no turbulence expected, First Officer Gürgen noted. Perfect, Captain Erdem replied, adjusting his headset. Let's get her off the ground smoothly. With clearance from air traffic control, the aircraft rumbled to life, its Kyr, twin Rolls-Royce RB211 engines producing a deep, thunderous roar. The plane taxied to the runway, its navigation lights piercing through the Caribbean night. At exactly 11:42 p.m., Flight 301 began its takeoff roll, accelerating down the runway. But from the moment the wheels left the ground, something was wrong. The first sign of trouble, as soon as the plane lifted into the air, the crew noticed an anomaly. The airspeed indicator, ASI, on Captain Erdem's side, was showing an abnormally high reading. Check your ASI, Erdem said, keeping his voice steady. Gürgen glanced at his own airspeed indicator. Mine shows 80 knots, Captain, he said, his voice edged with confusion. The disparity was alarming. Erdem's ASI was climbing rapidly past 200 knots, but Gürgen's indicated dangerously low speed. Instinct took over. If the aircraft was overspeeding, as Erdem's instruments suggested, structural damage could occur. He pulled back on the control column slightly, trying to stabilize, but Gürgen hesitated. His own instruments suggested the opposite. They weren't flying fast enough. Autopilot engaged, Erdem announced, hoping the aircraft's systems would manage the speed more accurately. But instead of stabilizing, things became worse. The autopilot, believing the aircraft was flying dangerously fast, began to compensate by reducing thrust. The engines spooled down, the aircraft losing vital speed. A subtle yet ominous vibration rippled through the fuselage. Then, an alarm blared. Stall! Stall! Chaos unfolds. The cockpit became a whirlwind of flashing warnings and conflicting information. The autopilot, still receiving erroneous airspeed data, was unknowingly guiding the aircraft toward disaster. We're not stalling, Captain Erdem insisted. His ASI still displayed high speed, making no sense with the stall warning blaring. Their ears. Captain, my instruments say something else. Then realization struck. Erdem's mind raced. The erratic airspeed readings, the aircraft's strange behavior. A memory surfaced. Something from training, something about blocked pitot tubes. Pitot tubes, he exclaimed. They must be obstructed. The pitot tubes, small, crucial sensors on the exterior of the aircraft, measured airspeed. If blocked, they could send false data to the cockpit. If this was the cause, the aircraft wasn't actually overspeeding. It was likely flying far slower than they thought. But by the time the realization dawned, the autopilot had already disengaged. The Boeing 757, now flying too slowly to maintain altitude, began to sink toward the dark Atlantic. The stick shaker rattled violently against Erdem's hands, a final desperate warning. Stall! We need power! Gürgen shouted, his voice straining. Against the mounting fear, Erdem slammed the throttles forward, but it was too late. The aircraft's nose pitched up sharply, the engines screaming in protest. A sickening lurch. Then, the wings lost lift entirely. The plane entered a deadly roll to the right. The final moments inside. The cabin panic erupted as gravity twisted unnaturally. Passengers screamed, overhead compartments burst open, and unsecured objects flew wildly. Flight attendants struggled to remain calm, bracing for impact. In the cockpit, Erdem fought desperately. "Come on, come on." His voice was barely audible over the warning sirens. He wrenched the yoke, trying to level the wings. But the Boeing 37 was no longer responding. The altimeter spun downward in a dizzying blur. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, impact. The aircraft struck the ocean at nearly 300 miles per hour. The force of the crash was unimaginable. The fuselage shattered upon contact, sending debris scattering across the water's surface. In an instant, Flight 301 was gone. The aftermath and the answer rescue teams scoured the waters off the Dominican coast, but there were no survivors. All 189 souls on board perished. Investigators later confirmed Captain Erdem's late realization: blocked. Pitot tubes had indeed caused the airspeed indicators to malfunction, but the critical question remained: why were the pitot tubes blocked? During the investigation, it was discovered that the aircraft had been sitting unused on the ground for weeks before the flight. In the warm, humid climate, this had allowed insects, likely wasps, to nest inside the pitot tubes. These tiny obstructions proved fatal, feeding incorrect airspeed data to the cockpit. Had the crew suspected pitot tube blockage earlier, they might have switched to alternate airspeed references, or disabled the autopilot sooner. But with limited time and conflicting readings, confusion sealed their fate. Birgenair Flight 301 became one of aviation's most tragic examples of how a small, overlooked factor, just a few insects, could bring down a modern airliner. And in the chaos of the cockpit, where every second counted, the truth had come too late. The deep silence. The Atlantic Ocean swallowed Flight 301 in an instant. One moment, the aircraft had been tearing through the air, engines screaming against the pull of gravity. The next, there was only silence, an eerie, endless quiet, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves over the wreckage. The night remained undisturbed. No fiery explosion, no plume of smoke, only fragments of shattered fuselage floating on the black water, their white surfaces reflecting the ghostly moonlight. A torn seat cushion drifted aimlessly. A child's stuffed toy, soaked and abandoned, bobbed among the debris. For a while, the ocean held its secrets close. Then the world began to take notice. The search begins at 5:30 a.m., nearly 6 hours after Flight 301's scheduled departure. Alarm bells rang in airline control rooms across the world. Birgenair 301, do you copy? The Dominican Republic's air traffic control repeated the transmission, their voices laced with growing tension. There was no response. By dawn, search and rescue teams were mobilized. The Dominican Navy, along with local fishing vessels, scoured the waters near Puerto Plata, hoping, praying for any sign of life. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their spotlights sweeping across the endless blue. But the ocean gave nothing back. Then, at 7:12 a.m., a report crackled through the radio. We have debris. Within hours, floating wreckage confirmed the worst. Suitcases bobbed among shattered pieces of fuselage. A tangle of oxygen masks drifted near a ripped section of the cabin wall. The sickening realization spread like wildfire. There would be no survivors. Echoes of the past in Istanbul. The headquarters of Birgenair descended into chaos. Journalists crowded the airline's offices, demanding answers. Grieving family members flooded the phone lines, desperate for any news. Airline officials struggled to respond, their faces pale and drawn. One of the flight attendants, Elif Demir, had called her sister just hours before takeoff. "Only one more flight," she had said cheerfully. "Then I'll be home." Now. Her sister sat frozen by the television, watching footage of debris being pulled from the ocean. Meanwhile, in Frankfurt, an airport waiting lounge, once filled with expectant families, had turned into a place of wailing and despair. A mother collapsed to her knees, clutching her chest, as an airline representative confirmed her worst fear. A father stood in stunned silence, his shaking hands clutching a crumpled itinerary. The name printed on it no longer belonged to the living. The world had changed in an instant. Piecing together the mystery as the days passed, the investigation into Flight 301's sudden demise began in earnest. The Dominican Republic's aviation authorities worked alongside Boeing and the Turkish Directorate General of Civil Aviation, searching for the truth. The wreckage was scattered across the ocean floor, 70 feet below the surface. Divers combed through the twisted remains of the fuselage, searching for the black boxes, the flight data recorder, and cockpit voice recorder. It took 3 agonizing days before they found them. When investigators played back the cockpit recordings, the truth emerged in painful clarity: the confusion, the conflicting airspeed readings, the panicked attempts to recover from the stall, the moment when Captain Erdem realized, too late, that they had been fighting a ghost. The pitot tubes, small, unassuming sensors, had doomed the flight before it even left the ground. The weight of a tragedy. Month after the crash, a ceremony was held in Frankfurt for the victims. A sea of mourners gathered, some clutching framed photographs, others staring blankly at the rows of white flowers arranged in memory of the lost. The airline executives who had once dismissed maintenance delays now stood in the back, avoiding eye contact, their faces lined with guilt. Birgenair would never recover from this disaster. Within months, the company folded, its name forever tied to the tragedy. For pilots around the world, Flight 301 became a case study in fatal misinterpretation. The industry would later mandate better training for pitot tube failures, ensuring that no crew would ever face such confusion again. But for the families left behind, no technical explanation could fill the void. No investigation report could bring back those lost to the sea. Somewhere in the vast Atlantic, beneath the rolling waves, pieces of Flight 301 still rested, silent, forgotten relics of a night when chaos took control and the sky refused to forgive. The ocean keeps its secrets even now, years later. The memory of Flight 301 lingers. Perhaps on quiet nights when the wind is still and the sea stretches endlessly under a silver moon, you can almost hear them, the voices of those lost, carried by the waves. A whisper, a warning, a reminder that sometimes the smallest mistakes cast the longest shadows, and that in the cockpit, where every second matters, there is no room for doubt.